in today was opened to the public in 1946 as a collection of early Americana by two brothers, Albert and Cheney Wells. Out of the Wells family that owned American Optical over in Southbridge, next town southeast of here. They made lenses and glasses. Most of these buildings that you see around here today were brought in from other parts of New England to recreate a very small slice of the 1830s. They had purchased this piece of property to put the museum here 10 years prior to that, 1936, because it already had a grist mill site, a sawmill site, and the mill pond down below here. And they wanted to show how water power influenced the 1830s as the start of the Industrial Revolution. The rest of this was a farm. Got almost ready to open up, then World War II started. That's why we never opened up till 1946. We've seen a lot of changes over the years. When the village first opened up, we only had a handful of buildings. Only had 81 paid visitors here the first day. At that time, you could tour the village in your car for $1. I've had horses in here on a special promotional day we had before the pandemic. We had over 13,000 people here in one day.
Wow.
Tonight, I'm just doing a little loop around the common. I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about some of the history behind the village, some of the buildings as we go along. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask, okay? We'd like to ask that everybody please remain seated. Thank you. Have you folks all been in this building over here?
Nope.
That's the Bullet Tavern. That was actually parts of two different buildings, parts of the covered bridge. The Wells brothers put together to suit their needs when it first opened up. Needed a place for food service and more modern restrooms. You go through this door over here on your left, brings you to an exhibit area, what a tavern would look like in the early 1800s. Stay straight through that exhibit area, brings into the Great Room, which is a banquet hall. There's beautiful arch timbers that came from a covered bridge out in Bishop, New York originally. Before the pandemic, we used that room for a lot of special functions. Private parties, wedding receptions, business meetings, Thanksgiving dinner. You go through this door over here to your right, brings you to another small exhibit area. We also have some 21st century restrooms directly through that door. Upstairs we have some office space for some of our interpretational staff. Downstairs we have a cafeteria that's open from 11 to 4. All right, please sit down. Originally we called that building the Village Inn. Later on we changed the name to the Bullet Tavern, named it after Cromwell Bullet. He was a prominent innkeeper here in Sturbridge in the early 1800s. He was an agent for the Hartford to Worcester stage line, known what is now the Public House over on Route 131 here in town. Oh, I actually had a copy of an 1838 Concord stagecoach that I rattled around here this afternoon for a couple hours. This big white federal looking place over here on the east end of the common is the Salem Townhouse. This was originally over on Route 31 in Charlton, next town east of here. Salem Town was a progressive farmer and a politician. At one time, 13 people lived in that house and peddled dairy products as far east as Boston. There's a room upstairs that served as a Masonic meeting house, which was over in Charlton. It's also where they filmed part of the movie Hawaii here with Julie Andrews back in the early 60s. This unpainted building over here to your right, the porch on the front, is the Minor Grant Store and Bake Shop. They're open today. They have hot coffee, delicious cookies and fudge, tinware, pottery, all kinds of goodies for sale in here. This building was purchased down in Stafford Springs, Connecticut in 1938 for just $300. We got that when they widened Stafford Street.
Wow.
You can get out here if you wish. If there's room. I didn't hook anybody with hot coffee, cookies, and fudge. I don't know. I don't know if you want to ride with these people. I guess not. Careful, go ahead. This brick building over here to your right is the Thompson Bank. This was brought in from Thompson, Connecticut in 1955. One of the few buildings that we actually moved in one piece. Basically created that, put it on the back of a truck and moved it here. You'd be hard pressed to do that today because of some of the bridges and the power lines. Even back then it was an issue. The most direct route was 19 miles, with 43 miles of that to bring it in. Building weighs over 30 tons. This yellow house over here to your right is the Finch House. This came out of Willimantic, Connecticut. This started out as like a small house out in front. It was a little two-room farmhouse. Then as the family grew, they added on to it 3 times. The original structure dates back to 1737. Last addition on the back there dates back to 1830. This unpainted house over here to your right with the red trim is the oldest house in the village. This is the Fennel House, dates back to 1724. This was donated to Old Sturbridge Village by the Canton Historical Society. The village depicts this as the house of an elderly widow and her daughters. Make their living out of spinning and weaving and pushing a needle sewing. We do a lot of wool dyeing and textile demonstrations over here during the day.
Wants to be done.
Huh?
Wants to be done.
So I heard people clapping. This is a horse I pulled in competition from Taylorsville, Kentucky, Jersey, Ontario.
Yeah.
He thinks he's just done something wonderful.
Oh.
Kind of a ham.
We have a few of those.
This barn over here to your right is the result of a barn raising demonstration that we did back in 1986 and 87. All of the beams in this building were hand hewn here at the village by our craftsmen. All the lumber was sawn at a water-powered sawmill down on the mill pond that we built in 1983 and 84. All the hardware was made at the blacksmith shop. We had a crew of about 20 historic interpreters that saw that from start to finish. In the end, we had a barn raising demonstration just like you would have done in the 1830s. Except, of course, we had to wear hard hats because of OSHA regulations. This big white meeting house directly in front of you up here on the west end of the common. It's only moved a few miles. This was brought in from the Fistale area of Sturbridge. This building was acquired by Ruth Wells, the village's first director in 1947. Had been built by the Sturbridge Baptist Society. They were joining denomination with another church in town. Ruth constructed a deal where she traded a new electric Hammond organ for the new church in that building. The village moved it here shortly afterwards. It was actually the second time that building was moved. The first time was in 1838, just 6 years after it was originally constructed over on Route 131, right where the annex is now, kind of diagonal from the town offices, just above the cemetery. The Fisk family purchased it, moved it from over there up to Fistale with oxen and rollers. They cut the building into 2 sections, front and back, divided it right by the second window. Took them 13 and a half weeks to move it about 3.5 miles. The village moved it, we left the oxen in the barnyard, we had Southbridge trucking distance on local business. The steeple was an add-on, the original steeple had blown off. Please do not touch the horse. The original steeple had blown off with the hurricane in 1938 when it was over in Fistale. They had never replaced it. The village built that one on there after they moved it. This new structure over here to your right is our cabinet maker's shop. We put that up last year in conjunction with our 75th anniversary. All the beams in the frame were either hand hewn here at the village by our craftsmen or sawn at our water-powered sawmill. We mortised all the joints out in front of the public. Then unfortunately it became a hybrid. We put up a new structure, we don't get the exemptions that we do when we move an old one. We have to go by modern building codes.
Are those dead people always there?
Those are old stones but no bones. There's nobody
Nobody
buried
there?
there that we're
Okay.
aware of. Most of those stones came from what is now Quabbin Reservoir.
Oh.
When the Metropolitan District Commission flooded the towns in western Massachusetts, to create a drinking water reservoir for the city of Boston, they moved all the graves that they were aware of. The families of the deceased had rights to have new markers. The old markers were discarded. They ended up in the hands of a guy up in Vermont. We ended up buying them. All right, yeah. The stone wall enclosure over here to your right is a town pound. That's where farmers would put any livestock they found wandering loose in the town until it could be rightfully claimed by its owner for a fee. Somebody'd have to pay the pound keeper. If your animals had done damage to somebody's crops or personal property, you'd have to make restitution before they were released. Nobody claimed them in 30 days, they'd be auctioned off. The town would keep the proceeds. The little red building across the road from that is a shoe shop. During the day, we have a shoemaker working in there. By the 1830s, little shoe shops like that dotted the countryside. More people were employed in the shoe industry than any other industry, other than textiles and agriculture. New England was exporting millions of pairs of shoes, shipping them all over the world. Young ladies would be sewing the soft leather uppers at home. They'd trade them to the storekeeper so that their family would have a credit at the store. He'd sell them to the shoemakers. They're all working on their own orders. They'd finish the product and then ship them from there. According to our records, Massachusetts alone produced over 15 million pairs of shoes in 1830. At that time, there were less than 13 million people in the whole country. The next building down on the right-hand side is a district schoolhouse. We moved out of Candia, New Hampshire back in the mid-50s. By the 1830s, most towns were broken up into districts. All the kids in each district between the ages of 4 and 17 would go to the same one-room schoolhouse. We might have anywhere between 25 and 50 kids in there at one time. All different ages, all working at their own lessons at their own rate of speed. You'd have one teacher. Your teacher would correct your lessons and keep order in the classroom, but you learned by memorization. It was not uncommon for kids to have to walk 2 or 3 miles to go to school each day. They'd be going to school in the middle of the winter and the middle of the summer. In the spring, they'd stay home, help their family prepare the ground and plant their crops. In the fall, they'd stay home and help harvest and get ready for winter. There are no grades, no graduations, no truancy laws. That schoolhouse had been preserved because New Hampshire's late governor, Frederick Smith, went to school there as a child. Have you folks been out to our pottery shop just beyond there?
Yeah, I want that.
That shop was built by a farmer named Hervey Brooks down in Goshen, Connecticut in 1819. Hervey was a full-time farmer and a part-time potter. He'd work in his shop on rainy days or if the ground was too wet to work. The first year Hervey had his shop, he built an updraft bottle kiln, like that brick reproduction that we're firing tonight. He loaded that with redware and heated it up to 1900 degrees to cure it. That first firing gave him such an excess of goods that he never fired it again for 8 years. You can only trade so many pots with your neighbors where they don't need it. Didn't have much of a marketing plan. After that, he built up his business, built up his clientele, took on some orders from a couple of local stores, and he fired it once every year from 1828 till 1864. Last time was when he was 85 years old. Last year we had record rainfall most of the summer. Ended up being the longest kiln fire we've ever had. It took him about 53, 54 hours and over 4.5 cords of wood to get that up to 1900 degrees. We're hoping that this year it'll be much, much quicker. When you folks were up there, did you notice how much this road is cut into that banking? Did you stop and think, why would a nonprofit organization spend that kind of time and effort to dig out a country lane out of a banking? This road was actually part of the Grand Trunk Railroad that was never finished. It was supposed to be an express line from Palmer, Massachusetts to Providence, Rhode Island. And the gentleman that funded most of it, Charles Belville Hayes, died on the Titanic, and his dream of a railroad died with it. This was already here before the Wells brothers bought this piece of property. This big white store over here to your right is the Ace of Night store. This was brought in from Dummerston, Vermont. Oh. We opened that to the public in 1972. It took us a while to get the inventory together. We actually had an inventory list of what was in that building in 1838. About 70% of the inventory in there is stuff for people to make their own clothes. Young ladies as young as 8 or 9 years old might be doing all the family sewing. How old are you girls? You mind me asking?
I'm 10.
You're
I'm
10?
7.
Do you make all your family's clothes?
No.
Where do you get them?
At the store.
There wasn't a store in the United States where you could buy clothes that were already pre-made in 1830. People had to make all their own clothes. They have buttons and hooks, they have needles and thread, they have pattern, they have scissors, they have cloth, everything you need. This little white building over here underneath this elm tree is our law office. That was brought in from Woodstock, Connecticut, 1965. Another building we moved in 1 week. Not nearly the challenge the bank was. By the 1830s, little law offices like that started to pop up all over New England. They offer a lot more customer confidentiality, a separate room in the house. This white salt box over here derives the Richardson parsonage. This was brought in from the Podunk area of East Brookfield. That's where we portray that our minister and his family lived. Oh. There is an area called Podunk. It's a Native American word for soft, marshy ground. It's just off of Route 49, heading north toward Spencer. Most of the time in the 1830s, a minister's contract would include his housing. If it didn't, you could rent a house like this in the 1830s for between $50 and $80 a year. You could buy it for $600 or $700. You been to Home Depot lately? Yeah. This barn out back is the only building we have that didn't come out of New England. That was brought in from Schoolhouse, New York. Actually, the first building was moved here in 1937. Changed the roof line to make it look a little bit more New England style instead of Dutch architecture, and added that small door on the right hand side. The little building on the corner is the tin shop, and the tin are working in there during the day, every day. But anything you've seen made out of tin right here at the village would be removed right there. Oh. We still have some 21st century food and beverage over here in this little tent. You can get out here if you wish.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.